I'm sure we've all been on some weird dates, but one I went on several months before meeting my future wife Stephanie was completely bizarre. Even now, thinking back to it makes no sense. For backstory, I had been using various dating apps and had just matched with this woman on Tinder. Her name was Emily, and from our chats, she seemed perfectly normal, friendly, witty, with a quirky sense of humor that drew me in. After a few days of messaging, we decided to meet at her place for a laid-back Netflix date. It sounded simple enough, just a night of chilling on the couch with some snacks and a good show. But what happened that night was anything but relaxing. When I pulled up to Emily's house, it looked like any other suburban home, neatly trimmed bushes, a porch light glowing softly, nothing out of the ordinary. She greeted me at the door with a warm smile, wearing a cozy sweater that made her look inviting. Her house smelled faintly of lavender, and the living room was dimly lit with a couple of lamps casting a soft glow. We made small talk as we settled onto her couch, a bowl of popcorn between us. She suggested a new thriller series that had just dropped on Netflix, and I was all for it. The vibe felt right, until it didn't. As the show started, I noticed the room was cooler than I'd expected. Not freezing, just a little brisk, like someone had left the AC on longer than necessary. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring it was just how she kept her place. We were sitting close, about to get cozy under a blanket she tossed over the couch, when I saw her reach for a small remote on the coffee table. She pressed a button and I heard a low hum, like machinery kicking on somewhere in the house. The air got a touch colder, but I brushed it off and focused on the screen. 10 minutes later, a shiver began to run through me. The cold was literally starting to seep into my bones, and I glanced at Emily. She was just staring at the TV, completely unfazed, her face lit up by the flickering light of the show. I shifted closer to her, hoping to steal some warmth, but she edged away slightly, still glued to the screen. Then she grabbed the remote again. Another press, another hum, and the room dropped a few more degrees. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone light. "Is it just me, or is it getting chilly in here?" She turned to me with a small, almost playful smile. "Oh, I like it cool. Keeps me alert. Don't you think it's kind of refreshing?" I forced a laugh, not wanting to seem high maintenance. "Yeah, I guess. Just not used to it, that's all." She nodded and went back to watching, so I tried to ignore the growing chill and focus on the plot. But honestly, it was hard to concentrate when my fingers started feeling stiff. By the time we were halfway through the second episode, I couldn't take it anymore. My arms were covered in goosebumps, and I was rubbing my hands together to keep the blood flowing. Emily, meanwhile, looked as comfortable as ever, curled up on her side of the couch like it was a warm summer night. I caught her reaching for the remote yet again, and this time, the hum that followed was louder, like some heavy-duty system powering up. A blast of cold air hit me from a vent I hadn't noticed above the couch. "Emily," I said, my voice trembling slightly from the cold. "I'm sorry, but it's really freezing in here. Could we maybe turn the heat up a bit?" She looked at me, her expression blank for a moment before softening. "Oh, is it? I didn't even notice. The heater's been finicky lately, so I try not to mess with it, but I'll fix it for you." She pressed a few buttons on the remote, but instead of warmth, the air got colder. The hum turned into a steady drone, and I swear I could feel the temperature plummet. It wasn't just a regular AC unit. This sounded like something industrial, something you'd find in a warehouse, not a living room. My teeth started chattering, and I looked at her, stunned. "Did you just turn it down?" I asked, unable to hide my disbelief. Her eyes widened, all innocence. No, I turned it up. It might just take a minute to kick in." But I wasn't imagining it. The cold was unbearable now, cutting through my jacket like it was nothing. I started questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was I just bad at handling a little chill? Then I exhaled, and there it was, a faint cloud of breath hanging in the air. That's when I decided that this definitely wasn't normal. No one's house should be cold enough to see her breath indoors, not unless something was seriously wrong. I stood up and spoke directly to Emily. "I'm sorry, but I've got to go. I'm not feeling great, and it's way too cold for me." She looked up at me, her face a mix of surprise and something unsettling, maybe disappointment, but maybe something darker. "Oh, really? We're just hitting the best part of the show." "Yeah, I'm sure," I said, forcing a smile as I edged towards the door. "Maybe another time, when the heater's working." As I reached for the doorknob, she called out, "Wait, don't you want to stay? I can make it warmer, I promise." Her voice was calm, almost too calm, and it sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I didn't look back. I bolted to my car, the icy air clinging to me even outside. My hands were literally shaking as I started the engine, and it wasn't just from the cold. I drove off, glancing in the rearview mirror at her house, half expecting to see her standing in the doorway. The street was empty, but the unease stayed with me the whole way home. To this day, I don't know what Emily was up to. Was she just quirky, obsessed with frigid temperatures? Or was there something worse going on, something I escaped by leaving when I did? All I know is that I'm thankful I got out of there, and even more thankful I met Stephanie a few months later. She keeps our place at a nice, sane 72 degrees, and I've never had to see my breath indoors since. A few years ago, I worked at one of our local supermarkets, mostly doing stock work. It wasn't too bad for the most part, and a big plus was my coworkers, some of whom I still keep up with to this day. There was one guy named Ben who, for some reason, liked to sneak off into the refrigerated sections and watch Netflix on his phone. I'm not sure if this was some kind of running joke since before I got there, or if he was trying to see if our manager would catch on, but it seemed like he did it at least once during every shift. The store itself was your typical small-town supermarket. You had your bright, bustling front with the registers in the produce section, but the deeper you went, the more it changed. The refrigerated sections and freezers were tucked way in the back, past the meat counter and the discounted baked goods. Those areas were always cold, of course, but they also felt off. The lights were dimmer back there, casting long shadows between the shelves, and the constant drone of the cooling units gave everything a low, eerie hum. Ben, though, he loved it, apparently. He'd grab his phone, slip into the dairy cooler or the big walk-in freezer, and just sit there, watching his shows like it was his personal movie theater. At first, we all thought it was funny. Ben was a laid-back guy, tall, skinny, always wearing this faded hoodie under his work vest. He'd come out of the freezer after 20 minutes, grinning, saying stuff like, "You gotta try it, man, it's the best spot in the store." We'd roll our eyes and get back to work. The manager didn't seem to care much either. As long as Ben got his tasks done, he let it slide. But at some point, it stopped being just a joke. It started with little things. I'd be restocking the milk and hear this faint tapping sound coming from the freezer, like someone was knocking on the inside of the door. I'd peek in, expecting to see Ben, but half the time he wasn't even scheduled that day. Other coworkers noticed stuff too, doors left cracked open when no one had been in there, or the temperature gauges spiking for no reason. One girl, Sarah, swore she saw frost forming on the glass doors in weird patterns, almost like fingerprints, but she laughed it off like she didn't want to sound crazy. Ben himself didn't do anything to help. He started getting weirder about his freezer time. He'd stay in there longer, sometimes an hour or more, and when he came out, he'd be quiet, almost dazed. His excuses got more bizarre as well. Lost track of time, he'd mumble, or the Wi-Fi's better in there. Of course, the Wi-Fi being good inside of a metal freezer didn't make any sense, but I don't think any of us pushed him on it. He was still Ben, after all. Then came the night I saw something I couldn't explain. It was late, maybe 9 p.m. I was tasked with organizing the frozen pizzas. The store was mostly empty, just me and a cashier up front. I heard that tapping again, louder this time, coming from the walk-in freezer. I figured Ben was at it again. He'd been in there earlier, so I went to check. I pushed the heavy door open, and the cold hit me like a slap. The air was thick with mist, more than usual, and I could barely see past my own hand. "Ben?" I called out. No answer. The tapping stopped, replaced by this faint, scratchy sound, like static from a bad TV. I stepped inside, my boots squeaking on the icy floor, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting cross-legged in the back corner, his phone glowing in front of him. But he wasn't watching Netflix. The screen was flickering, showing nothing but white noise, and Ben was staring at it, unblinking, his breath coming out in sharp, shallow puffs. "Ben, are you okay?" I said, louder this time. He didn't move. I got closer, and the static sound grew sharper, almost like whispers layering over each other. I couldn't make out words, but it felt wrong, like something was trying to talk through the noise. I grabbed his arm, his skin was ice cold, way colder than it should have been, and he finally looked at me. His eyes were glassy, pupils tiny, and he smiled a slow, creepy smile. "They're almost here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I yanked my hand back. "Who's almost here? What are you talking about?" He didn't answer. He just turned back to his phone, and the static cut out, leaving dead silence. I didn't wait around. I bolted out of there and told the cashier we needed to get the manager. I didn't want to risk provoking Ben in whatever state he was in. But by the time he came back just a minute later, Ben was already gone. His phone was still there, lying on the floor, screen dark. We figured he'd slipped out the back, but his jacket was still hanging in the break room, and his car keys were in his locker. Over the next few days, Ben didn't show up for work. We called him and texted him, all with no response. His phone, the one we'd found, wouldn't even turn on anymore, like the battery had been completely drained. The manager filed a missing person report and the police came by to ask questions. They searched the store, focusing on the freezer, but found nothing unusual. No signs of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. They said maybe he just walked off, maybe he was going through something personal, but we all knew that wasn't it. A week later, I was closing up alone. I avoided the freezer all night, but I had to do a final walkthrough before locking up. As I passed the refrigerated section, I heard it, that tapping again, faint but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding, and glanced at the freezer door. It was shut tight, locked for the night, but through the little window I saw something. A shadow, tall and thin, standing inside. It didn't move and didn't make a sound. Instead, it just stood there, watching me. I didn't stick around to figure out what it was. I ran out, quit the next day, and never went back. The store's still open, and I hear they've got new employees who don't know the story. But sometimes, when I drive by at night, I see those freezer lights flickering through the windows, and I wonder if Ben's still in there. Or if whatever he was waiting for finally showed up. I've worked in HVAC for a little over 10 years, and though I have my share of weird and even scary stories, there is only one truly bizarre experience. It happened a few years after I started. I was working on this big industrial site and got paired up with another technician named Steve. Steve was a funny guy, but didn't goof off and put in his work, at least, aside from one really strange habit. Anytime we'd get a break, he'd try to climb into one of the ducts or air handlers and start watching Netflix on his phone. The site was a sprawling, outdated warehouse, its massive steel skeleton crisscrossed with a network of oversized ducts that carried cool air through the stifling heat of the machinery floors. Overall, the place had an ominous feel. Shadows stretched long under flickering fluorescent lights, and the air buzzed with the low hum of fans and compressors. Steve, though, treated it like his own personal playground. During breaks, he'd wedge himself into the nearest duct opening, claiming it was the perfect spot to chill out, literally. "It's like my own little cave," he'd say with a grin, his phone propped up as some show flickered in the dimness. At first I didn't think much of it. Steve was a solid worker, always on time, quick with a fix, and full of dumb jokes that kept the monotony at bay. His duct diving seemed harmless, just a weird quirk. I'd see him crawl out after 15 or 20 minutes, brushing dust off his coveralls, raving about whatever episode he just finished. Once, I even peeked in after him, curious. The duct was narrow, cold, and smelled faintly of rust and mildew. I could hear the tinny sound of his show echoing off the metal, but the tightness of the space made my chest constrict. I just didn't get the appeal. After a couple months, though, Steve's habits started to change. His breaks stretched longer, sometimes 40 minutes or more, and he'd come back quieter and less chatty. His usual energy seemed drained, like the cool air in those ducts was sucking something out of him. I'd catch him staring off into space, his fingers tapping nervously on his tools. "You good, man?" I'd ask. He'd nod and force a laugh, then say, "Yeah, just hooked on this new series. Keeps me up there longer than it should." But something in his eyes didn't match his words. They were sunken, shadowed, like he hadn't slept in days. And then there were the noises. When Steve was up in the ducts, I started hearing things, soft scrapes and faint thuds, like something shifting in the distance. I figured it was just the system kicking on, or maybe some loose debris rattling around. Old buildings like that are full of quirks. But one time, while he was gone on a break, I heard a sound that stopped me cold, a low, guttural growl, muffled but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the duct he'd climb into. I brushed it off as my imagination, but it stuck with me. Then one day, it all went wrong. We were servicing a huge air handler near the back of the warehouse, a spot so remote you could go hours without seeing another soul. Steve, true to form, slipped into the duct above it during our lunch break. I stayed below, fiddling with the pressure gauge, when a sound ripped through the silence, a scream, raw and panicked, unmistakably Steve's. It bounced off the metal walls, chilling me to the bone. I bolted to the access hatch, shouting, "Steve, what's going on?" No response, just a frantic rustling, like he was clawing his way through the duct. My hand shook as I climbed up after him, flashlight beams slicing through the pitch-black tunnel. For some reason, the air just felt wrong, thick, almost alive with a faint, sour stench I couldn't place. "Steve!" I yelled again, my voice echoing back at me. Finally, I found him, curled up where the duct widened into a junction. He was pressed against the wall, his phone lying beside him, its screen glowing faintly with the Netflix logo frozen mid-load. His face was ashen, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. "What happened?" I demanded, grabbing his shoulder. He flinched like I'd burned him, his wide eyes darting past me into the dark. "Get me out," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Get me out now." I didn't want to argue with him. I half dragged him back to the hatch, his body trembling so hard I thought he'd collapse. Once we were out, he slumped against a crate, staring at the floor. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill of the warehouse. "What did you see?" I pressed, my heart still hammering. He shook his head, lips clamped tight. "You don't want to know," he muttered, almost to himself. "You don't want to know what's in there." I tried to get more out of him, but he shut down completely after that. He wouldn't look at me and wouldn't talk. Instead, he just kept rubbing his hands together like he was trying to scrub something off. That night, he didn't come back to the crew's motel. The next morning, he didn't show up for work. I called him half a dozen times, but it went straight to voicemail. By the end of the week, the supervisor told me Steve had quit. No notice, no explanation, just gone. For some reason, I couldn't let it go. A few days later, I was back at that same air handler, alone. The warehouse felt heavier somehow, the shadows deeper. As I worked, I heard it again, that low growl rolling through the ducts like a distant storm. My stomach twisted, but I had to know. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed up to the hatch, peering inside. The beam caught something glinting in the dark, a shard of Steve's phone, cracked and discarded. I edged closer, and that's when I saw it, scratches gouged into the metal, deep and jagged, like something had clawed its way through. Beyond them, the duct stretched into blackness, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement, a shape, hunched and impossibly large, shifting just out of sight. Then came the sound again, closer now, a guttural snarl that vibrated through the walls. I stumbled back, nearly falling out of the hatch, and slammed it shut. I didn't care what it was, a monster, an animal, or something else entirely. I wasn't going back in there. I never did see Steve again, and I never asked around about him. Whatever he saw in those ducts broke him, turned a guy who laughed at everything into a ghost who vanished without a trace. I still work HVAC, but I stick to open spaces now. No more tight corners and no more ducts. Every so often though, when I'm on a quiet job, I'll hear a faint scrape or a low rumble, and I'll freeze, wondering if it followed me. Or worse, if it's still waiting, up there in the cool, dark places where no one else dares to look.